The southern and northern colonies continue along divergent paths in the 17th and 18th centuries. Their physical environments are different, their populations diverse. But perhaps the factor that contributes most to their distinctiveness is the introduction of a slave labor system to the agricultural South.
It is really the South that commits itself to the kind of large-scale agriculture that needs, so many workers, so many hands, and for them slavery is really a great boon. In the early days, there are not enough white people who can either be drawn to the New World or forced to come to do this work, and so blacks really are the kind of human tools that open up that region agriculturally.
You begin to see the separation from the pack of larger plantations, larger concentrations of slaveholding, and larger concentrations of wealth that go with it. One of the characteristics of slave investment is that the rich get richer. It becomes more and more important to have money to buy slaves, to make money to buy more slaves, and along the way to produce more cotton or tobacco or rice or indigo. So more and more money and slaves and profits go into the hands of fewer and fewer people in the South. And this has great disadvantages for smaller farms, for non-slaveholding whites, or for slaveholding whites who have smaller holdings in slaves and land.
In contrast to the South, the northern economy is dominated by relatively small family farms and by towns and cities that are becoming centers of commercial activity. Economic development tends to be more diversified than in the South.
In the North, farming, agricultural produce, commerce, trade would be the major forms of economic growth and development. There would always be a significant minority of artisans, people moving into the building trades, some in mining, and in a kind of deepening complexity and sophistication in the economy as well.
For example, 40% of all of England's maritime shipping was manufactured, was made in North America. There was a huge shipbuilding industry. And there were more iron foundries and blast furnaces in North America than there were in England and Wales combined. The crude iron manufacture was something around half or a little less than half of Britain's, but the number of units participating, hence the need for labor, was huge.
Commercial activities are growing at an impressive rate, as are the number of goods and services available to the consuming public. And cities, even in the 17th century, play a prominent role in the economic and social life of the colonies.
We confuse things. We see American history as going from a kind of a rural environment to an urban industrial environment, so that cities are at the end of it. Or we see kind of an economic interpretation of American history where it goes from sort of a farming environment to a sophisticated urban environment, if that was Charles Beard, for example. Actually, I think you could argue that cities have always been part of the American experience.
These early population centers, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charlestown, are often referred to as walking cities.
To me, the really kind of interesting and remarkable thing about the walking city is that there was a real jumble of land use. So you didn't have like distinctive areas of the city devoted to one specific thing. Everything was mixed up. So you had residences and businesses and workshops where artisans were applying their trades, all mixed together, just kind of cheek by jowl. And relating to that, there was also a real mixture of people where you had the rich, very rich, living side by side with the very poor.
Although sharp social distinctions do exist here, Europe's more rigid class system does not find its way to the colonies.
In Europe, in England, you had a scarcity of land, land being the basis of the aristocracy. In the United States, it was the exact opposite. There was a tremendous amount of land and a population that was so loose over that was so widely scattered over that landscape that you had a scarcity of labor in any one place. And that truly influenced the way that the United States took shape.
Several basic and distinctly American forms of community emerge. The plantation, for example, characterizes a unique way of life for many white and black Southerners.
The South is much more rural, much more dependent on agriculture, and has a cash crop. both cotton and sugar and then tobacco in the late 17th and certainly by the 18th and early 19th centuries. And because the hard physical labor of those crops is done largely by slave labor, that slave labor supports a lifestyle for both women and men, which is quite unlike the lifestyle of women or men in the North.
In the southernmost coastal areas where there's very early large-scale plantation agricultural work, where people are growing rice and in some places cotton, you have slaves being socialized into large labor gangs where blacks who had preceded them or whites who were slave overseers are really sort of managing their adjustment. And they will work very often separately in male labor gangs and female labor gangs. Further north, what we call the Upper South, Maryland and Virginia, where it is tobacco largely that's grown. You have smaller plantations, and very often their slaves are socialized into their work on small plantations by the white farmers themselves and develop fairly well-connected partnerships there.
As the plantation society takes hold, an elite Southern gentry begins to emerge.
These are the people who have political influence. Their cousins are in the House of Burgesses or in the Colonial Assembly. And it's the Colonial Assemblies that are largely the ones making decisions about land grants or granting charters to companies that will speculate in lands. What we would call insider trading, I guess, a kind of insider deals. Part of the point here is that the political access and political influence were also associated with the slaveholding gentry, and that was another means of reinforcing their power.
Those Southern women fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to have slaves, and we should distinguish them because something like 20% of the population owned slaves in this period, so you're by no means talking about all Southerners. But well-off Southern plantation mistresses, that group of women, spend their time and energy managing plantations. They are business women in that sense, and the plantation, which is also a household, is fundamentally a business which is run on the labor of unfortunate people who are enslaved to do that labor. That creates, as one can imagine, all kinds of emotional tensions as well as all kinds of financial problems that women have to reckon with.
For African women, there is a dual burden.
There's the work of slavery, that is, whether it's field labor or house labor, and there's also the reproductive labor because these women are bearing property. While there are marriages that produce children, there's also fairly extensive non-consensual sexual relations because whether it's owners or other kinds of master class men who have access to slave women, and so they often bear children who will become the property of masters, but may not be by their choice.
There are incentives for women to reproduce, and the biggest incentive of all is that if you don't, you'll be sold. A family, at least in the eyes of a slave master, was made up of a woman and her children, not a woman, a man, and children. So you do get a sort of matrifocal family within the slave society.
Beyond the economic advantages of a slave-based labor system, the hold slavery has on the South changes the social order.
And the laws that emerge in these plantation societies have everything to do with how one behaves in a slave society. One may not marry a slave, and marriage between slaves is illegal. Of course, how do you put this delicately? There is no law that recognizes the rape of a black woman. Where, of course, there is for white women. The child's status is gotten through its mother, is traced through its mother. So if the mother is enslaved, then the child will be enslaved as well. You have a huge body of laws that governs the behavior of people in a way that in northern societies it just is not.
A very different form of community emerges in New England, one that is also distinctly American. Here, the primary social unit is not the isolated farm, but the town, a tightly knit community of people bound together by their town covenant.
The Puritans were quite insistent that they didn't want to spread out, that spreading out was bad for their culture, bad for their faith. If people spread out, all they'd care about would be their cattle, their farms, and they might even become like Indians.
in general, for all of these European settlers, the sense that you lived your life for yourself, that individual ambitions or desires were to be valued and pursued, would have been a foreign idea and would have been regarded as a dangerous idea and a highly selfish and perhaps destructive idea. The obligations to community and the sense that your actions were constrained by certain kinds of responsibilities and obligations to the community, and that you could depend on the community to help you out when you needed it. I think all of that is very, very powerful. And I think one practical or sort of palpable, tangible way to see that is in the spatial arrangements in these towns and even in households. The notion of privacy, as we would appreciate it and value it, was also a foreign idea. These houses, they're small. This notion that you would have separate bedrooms, that you would have a public room and a private room, people are living on top of each other. But there's nothing like the expectation of privacy that we would have for even the most intimate of activities. And that was how people lived.
So in order to sustain their particularly demanding culture, the Puritans were highly literate. They valued education. They valued close access to churches, and therefore they settled compactly, and the whole system of land distribution favored the organization of their communities as towns that were pretty much self-governing. And so the tradition of holding town meetings where they elected their own officers and chose their own bylaws developed in New England in a way that it didn't in the Chesapeake.
And everything was fair game for the town meeting. I mean, from the most important questions, a petition to the king about something or other, to what to do about the pigs roaming through the common lands, which actually turns out to be a highly significant and inflammatory question. It sounds trivial in some ways to us, but it wasn't by any means to them. Who to recruit to or impress into service to help build a road that will be of use to the whole town. All of these kinds of questions go to the town meeting. The town meeting also selected their kind of executive committee, which was the selectmen.
The selectmen, who would be typically the wealthiest and most learned and most eminent characters in town, also typically a pretty elderly bunch, would decide how they wanted the town to conduct its business. But the peculiarity of the town meeting, of course, is that when all of the eligible voters get together, there is a real premium that is put on consensus. So our concept of rule by a majority is really quite foreign to most 17th and even 18th century New Englanders.
In relative terms, it's a fairly democratic, fairly egalitarian system, one that reflects, again, the rough egalitarianism of the economic situation in early New England, where you didn't find large extremes, great extremes of either wealth or poverty. And again, in the early period, you would not find entrenched large engrossments of land in one man's hands or in one family's hands.
Colonial courts also played a significant role in the life of the town.
Colonial courts were not as specialized in their function as our courts are. All kinds of questions and considerations came before them. They had executive as well as judicial functions, and nothing was off limits to them.
For an historian, court records are an invaluable source of information about life in the colonies and what was important to the people of the time.
Because that was a way of getting at what were the values in the society or in any particular group or culture at a given moment that were worth upholding, worth defending. For instance, matters of sexual propriety are fairly obvious and would be common, but the raw sensitivity that they had about reputation clearly spoke to how important it was, especially in communitarian societies, and especially in societies dominated by face-to-face relationships in which personal credit, personal trustworthiness were important. Your reputation was all you had in many cases. There's a case in the mid to late 17th century in which a child called a woman, a manglestick. They sue. So we have two families and the children and all the neighbors and the judge. So this guy comes to court and says, this kid called my wife a manglestick. This clearly cannot be borne. This is unacceptable. We want an apology.
She is a manglestick.
The father of the kid who had done this said, no, this woman really is a manglestick. This isn't slander at all. It's true.
How dare you call my wife a manglestick, you filthy...
And they started yelling back and forth at each other, and everybody chimes in and has their 2 cents, which is another thing that is actually common in these courts. This is community gay, this is the community in action. So there are all kinds of bitterness, and more slanderous words are spoken in the course of this case. And And finally, the judge looks at me and says,
"Silence, everyone! What is a mangle stick?"
And they didn't know. They couldn't say what it was. And I thought that was a clear sign that they knew it wasn't good, they knew it was an insult, and they knew that an insult was not to be borne.
In the latter half of the 17th century, the well-ordered life New Englanders sought to establish begins to crumble with the advent of a series of calamitous events.
During the first half century of New England's history, up to around the mid-1670s, things had been going remarkably well. But then in the 70s and 80s, things go to hell in a handbasket, quite literally as far as the New Englanders were concerned.
They had pursued a godly experiment. They wanted to create this kind of utopia that would both enable them to live out godly lives and that would serve as a model for the rest of the world, the city on a hill. And in the 60s and 70s, they look around, they see the rising generation isn't as interested in religion, the rising generation is acting up and moving out. They're afflicted by signs from God that can only be interpreted as displeasure, smallpox epidemics, war with the Indians, the mysterious comet. Clearly God was not saying, "Good job, guys."
And all of these things, which seem to us today to be basically unconnected to witchcraft, were interlinked in their minds, so that the afflictions of the girls and young women in Salem Village sort of touches off all of this sort of latent hysteria. It's almost as though people really need a witch hunt to express all of these built-up fears about alien, invasive, malevolent forces. Usually, before 1692, witch trials involved one or a few people, whereas in 1692, 150 people are accused, 20 people lose their lives, 19 are hanged, one person is pressed to death under interrogation.
I saw the apparition of Giles Corey come and afflict me, urging me to write in his book, and so he continued most dreadfully to hurt me by times beating me and almost breaking my back, till the day of his examination being the 19th April. And then, also during the time of his examination, he did afflict and torture me most grievously, and also several times since urging me vehemently to write in his books. And I verily believe in my heart that Giles Corey is a dreadful wizard, for since he had been in prison, he or his appearance has come and most grievously tormented me.
This is not the first time, nor the only place, that people have been charged with witchcraft.
Fear of witchcraft is a part of everyday life in 17th century New England. And sometimes in witch trials, people would actually mention having conducted countermagical experiments which had seemingly identified somebody as a culprit, and they actually then expected the courts to accept that as incriminating evidence. If a piece of cheese had gone moldy unexpectedly, you might throw it in the fire in the hope of damaging the witch responsible. If your livestock had become ill for some unexplained reason, then you might cut off a part of the cow's ear or the pig's tail and throw it in the fire and hope that the person responsible would be burned. There's a case in 1692 where a witch is on trial, and one of the deponents comes forward and said that several years before his cow fell sick inexplicably, and so he gave the cow a good thrashing, and that the cow suddenly became revived and started to run around, as well it might. And then the next day, one of his neighbors noticed that Mercy Disborough, a local woman, was lying in bed and complaining of aches and pains. And the locals assume that the flogging of the cow has been translated back onto Mercy Disborough, and this is actually produced as incriminating evidence against her. Around 3/4 of accused witches before 1692 were acquitted because the authorities deemed the evidence against them to be inadequate. So the kinds of evidence being presented against the accused in 1692 became increasingly controversial throughout the summer and early fall of 1692, and criticism of the court's handling of this evidence mounted and mounted until eventually the governor felt he had no choice but to bring the proceedings to a halt. Now, the fact that more and more people of elite standing within the colony were also being accused by the late summer and early fall assuredly had something to do with it, and the fact that these accused included the governor's own wife was assuredly connected to the fact that this was all brought to an end. But the principal issue seems to have been the kinds of evidence that were being used to convict the individuals who were hanged. Now, many ordinary people did not share this concern, and although from our perspective the fact that 19 people were hanged for witchcraft was a grotesque injustice, from the point of view of some people at the time, the fact that only 19 people were hanged was the injustice, because many of these people really were convinced that these individuals were guilty and should be gotten rid of.
As the new century begins, a new force, the spirit of enlightenment, with its emphasis on science and reason, competes with traditional intellectual and religious values that become part of the Great Awakening.
What triggers the First Great Awakening is, of course, not religious persecution, but rather the appearance of a different kind of preacher. And this is the Reverend George Whitefield, a colleague of John and Charles Wesley in England. And he is also a fellow who has a very keen interest in acting and no inconsiderable thespian skills. Whitefield appears on American shores in the late 1730s, and he goes from one end of the seaboard to the next, draws hordes of enthusiastic hearers. In fact, there's a wonderful passage in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography where he talks about going to hear Whitefield speak in Philadelphia. And Franklin, of course, ever the empiricist, ever the rationalist, is pacing away from Whitefield's voice, trying to calculate the radius that his voice will travel. And evidently Franklin got quite a ways away because Whitefield had a real set of pipes. What is so compelling about Whitefield is his very dramatic, very heartfelt style of preaching. Preachers before Whitefield delivered sermons rather soberly.
From its beginnings in the mid-Atlantic colonies in the 1730s, the Great Awakening moves into New England. Only in later decades does it reach the South.
Southerners resist evangelicalism not only because of the occasional and quite muted testimony against slavery, but even more because of early evangelicalism's emphasis on the church over the nuclear family or the circle of extended kin. Of course, this is not a message that wins much favor among white Southerners, or black Southerners for that matter, who put a great priority on family relationships and family closeness.
The issue of slavery poses a challenge on a number of different fronts in the 18th century.
A lot of people were influenced by Enlightenment, especially Scottish Enlightenment ideas of the progression of history. And it was understood that all societies moved through certain predictable stages of development. And eventually you would decline. So the key often was to prolong the moment, the good moment, and protect it as long as possible. But it was inevitable that you would decline, as Rome had declined, for instance, which was very much on their minds. These were people in the latter part of the 18th century very concerned in political and in cultural and in scientific and in economic ways with progress and innovation, with achieving and then prolonging that high stage of development. And for many of them, slavery seemed to represent savagery and backwardness. Interestingly enough, they were not primarily concerned with slavery as a moral question until really the Revolutionary period and after, with a few exceptions like Quaker groups. Mostly the question was, does slavery reflect badly on us? Does it suggest that we are barbaric? And is it a regressive economic system that will inhibit our social and economic development? So the physical presence of so many slaves, the importance of slavery, the idea of slavery, all of those questions, all of those realities were different from what they had expected in England. They were distinctive. European travelers commented on precisely these questions. It wasn't just Americans' oversensitivity. It was obvious to everyone that this was different, and it was crucial to the nature of America. And one big question and worry was it crucial in ways that were destructive to Euro-American cultural identity?
And so, what had begun as a few small, precarious settlements in the wilderness has evolved by the mid-18th century into a large and complex society, distinguished by regional differences, but united by a shared acceptance of racial inequality, the importance of religion in their lives, and a belief in basic principles of law and politics that will, in just a few decades, lead to an imperial crisis.